Anyone witnessing former independent Senator John Gerald Furness-Smith contributing to a debate in Parliament during the 1980s may remember a very tall, slim man. What they will definitely recall was his style of delivery, precise and articulate, reserved yet commanding, stern but not severe. Someone who deserves to be identified as a dignified parliamentarian. Born in England in 1923, John Gerald was educated there up to tertiary level at Oxford University, where he studied history. From university, he served in the British Army for 3 years, in the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth nations in East Africa and India. On his return to England, he was admitted as a barrister by the Inner Temple, London in 1949, and subsequently to the Bar of Trinidad and Tobago in 1950. In 1956, he ceased to be a barrister at his own request, in order to be admitted as a solicitor of the High Court in England, and likewise in 1957 in Trinidad and Tobago. In those days, one either practiced as a barrister or solicitor. The current designation of attorney at law allows practicing at both levels. Choosing Trinidad and Tobago to establish a long and distinguished career in law was in itself an adventure for the young Furness-Smith. His parents were posted here under colonial rule, and he visited them, having accepted an initial 6-month job offer. Then fate stepped in, and soon he adopted T&T as home.
You meet Gerald and you look at him and you may think, that he is, from his accent and demeanor, he is a British subject, an old colonial. Now, though born, bred and educated in England, you have to appreciate that he has spent most of his life in Trinidad and Tobago. He may not be Trini to the bone, but this is his home, this is his country. And I was told, and this is indeed before my time, that he came here in the late 40s. He was smitten by this young lady, Joan Barbara Gilbert Rapsey, a glamorous and headstrong young woman whom he married in 1950. And I believe met on his journeys here. You have to appreciate that he was educated in Britain. His father was the last colonial Chief Justice. So he would have come out to Trinidad and been presented. And Joan was among many he met at those parties. And since then, he has lived in Trinidad and spent his life here.
On his admission as a solicitor, Furness-Smith became a partner of Fitzwilliam, Stone and Alcazar, later to become Fitzwilliam, Stone, Furness-Smith and Morgan. He served as senior or managing partner for 19 years from 1982 and was appointed senior counsel in 1990. He retired as a partner at the end of 2000, but has since continued to work with the firm as a fairly active consultant. At 85, he is still on the job today.
I mean, professionally, it's been the most interesting place to work and study law, and I've enjoyed it. And, I like Trinidad very much.
During pivotal parts of his career, Furness-Smith was joint editor of the Trinidad and Tobago Law Reports, served on the Council of the Law Society, on several boards and committees, and most notably as an independent senator from 1981 to 1991, having been appointed by the then President of Trinidad and Tobago, Sir Ellis Clarke.
But I was never in politics, but becoming an independent senator, then you sort of get into politics a little bit because you're free to talk. In fact, one has a duty to pass comments on the political scene in Parliament. And one has to do one's best to make an independent comment on all that's going on, which I tried to do.
John Gerald Furness-Smith's service as an independent senator to the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago emerged as one of the most outstanding terms, mainly due to his profound knowledge of the law and legislative processes, but more significantly because of his in-depth approach to his Senate contributions involving thorough research and analysis.
He was a man who carried a lot of dignity himself. The other thing that impressed me about him was his total professionalism, because it was his knowledge of the legislative process and his knowledge of legislation generally and his knowledge of how Parliament worked and the way in which legislation could be introduced, could be amended, and could be passed through all its stages. I learned everything practically that I knew about the parliamentary process in the Senate from him in that first year or two. And the dignity with which he did everything, I think, is one of the things that really stands out for me.
People don't understand that, I don't think. But it's a very, very difficult business, drafting the laws. Right? Well, and so I went in determined to try and do my best, because I think one was the only lawyer in Parliament, really. The fellows in the House of Representatives, elected members, even if they are lawyers, are not too concerned about the details of the laws. They're probably not such, they're not great lawyers, technical lawyers, you know. Anyway, so I made it my business every week to try and make sure that there were no little mistakes in the. Very often one got the laws bills quite late, terribly late sometimes, just a few days before one had to sit down. So anyway, I went through them carefully, and I'm sure Donna Hale, who is now has is now in that position. I'm sure she does the same. And I made a list of amendments. One thing I learned was that there's no use spouting about these little things in one's contribution unless one put forward an amendment. The thing didn't get really properly discussed at all. So early o'clock, I prepared sometimes quite a lengthy list of amendments, and at least if you put that list in, then when it came to the committee stage and the House goes through the bill clause by clause, each of these points comes up and is debated, and sometimes you got through with a few changes.
I can't say that we were very much a part and very involved in his parliamentary work, but I can tell you, as his partner then, that he devoted a considerable amount of time and effort to the legislative agenda. He took his senatorial duties very seriously. Now, the Hansard will speak volumes of his contributions in the Senate, but where it is silent is about his work behind the scenes, the countless hours that he would have spent here in the firm providing a review of bills, assisting the Attorney General or the Parliamentary Committee in preparing coherent legislation. You will not see that reflected in Hansard. Let me tell you, that was very much a part of his contribution. If I had to choose a particular bill, and I do this with some jest because I harass him about it from time to time, I would think that what comes to mind is the Foreign Investment Act, or Bill of 1990, which repealed the rather outdated and colonial aliens landholding legislation. And it really opened the doors of Trinidad and Tobago to foreign investment. Now, like most legislation then and now, it was passed in a great hurry. And while it has served its legislative purpose, in hindsight, 19, 20 years after, you know, from time to time I can point out to Gerald inconsistencies, or where perhaps the language is vague in the act that I refer to as his act. Of course, he strongly defends this and argues otherwise, and said it was a collective parliamentary effort, that he was only a small part of it.
Independents don't actually work together. Independents have to work independently, and that was one of the principles that he stood very strongly about. If you asked him for advice or for guidance or for his opinion, he would give it to you. And in working in joint select committees, he always was someone whose views you had to listen to because they were so reasoned and so logical. he was hard to contradict, because he always had done so much research and so much work on all of the bills that came before the Senate. And there is no one anymore that puts that kind of professionalism into the legal side of things that are presented before the Senate. It's not that Parliament doesn't have its own legal counsel, but someone of Gerald Furness-Smith's stature in the legal community has a measure of believability, a measure of integrity, and a measure of respect from the community as a whole.
Another one of Furness-Smith's colleagues in the Senate, former independent Senator Louise Horn, remembered a more humanitarian aspect of his parliamentary focus.
He was concerned about the plight of children, you know, whether enough was done to take care of children, the education of children, you know, and taking care of babies. Has enough been done when people are in difficulty to go to the hospitals, all these occasions? He was interested in people with special reference to children.
In 1995, John Gerald Furness-Smith was rewarded for his service to Trinidad and Tobago with one of the country's highest honors, the Shikonia Medal Gold of the Order of the Trinity. At first, he declined acceptance of the award, reasoning he had served as an independent senator, and these recommendations were decided by the cabinet and government in office. However, he eventually rescinded and is acknowledged as a national award recipient.
He was very committed to the country, having regard to his stint in the Senate of a decade, and for which he was granted the very high national award in the Shikonia Medal Gold. So I see him, therefore, as a motivator, an educator, and a committed citizen of Trinidad and Tobago, particularly for us, for which we are grateful, committed to our indigenous legal education.
In addition to his noteworthy acclaim as an independent senator, Furness-Smith's 50-plus years as a lawyer has gained him a reputation of possessing unequaled experience in almost all fields of law, including in recent years commercial, corporate, constitutional, and tax law.
Now, I've worked in my career with other great lawyers of Gerald's vintage, people like Tajmal Hussain, Michael Elabastide. But Gerald was my constant companion throughout my career, and certainly my greatest influence. You've asked about working experiences, and I can think of three areas if I were to give examples. Firstly, legislative review. Gerald and I were part of a team in the early 1990s who worked with the Bankers Association on the Financial Institutions Bill, where his knowledge as an independent senator was very well felt and very useful. Another example would be M&A work, mergers and acquisitions. Gerald and I were part of the process, first in Trinidad and Tobago, for taking United Bank private. We have also in this firm worked together on many projects, industrial projects, and one that comes to mind is the liquefied natural gas project, a very major undertaking where his advice and counsel as my review partner was priceless in preparing an appropriate commercial platform for an investment of that nature. And we all know what has happened to LNG in this country. It is by far, I would think, the most successful industry we're now into Train 4. It's a very valuable source of revenue for the government.
In her regular newspaper column, present independent Senator Dana Sitahal noted in May 2009, in each of the 9 sessions of Parliament, there has been a lawyer on the independent bench, and this has presumably been because Parliament is about the business of making legislation, and one would expect legal experience to be helpful in that regard. Such people, Martin Daly, Gerald Furness-Smith, and Michael de la Bastide, have been considered good lawyers with much experience in their areas. It is significant to observe that Furness-Smith is counted among the best by his peers, and indeed those whose lives he has touched.
I think that it's worth noting that Gerald Furness-Smith was not a politician in any sense of the word. He was a parliamentarian, and there's a great distinction there. And he was a statesman. And when I think back to those years and think back to Gerald in the Senate, I keep thinking of Shakespeare's quotation about, you know, that nature could stand up and say to all the world, this was a man. And that was Gerald Furness-Smith.
Married for 52 years to the former Joan Rapsay, the father of 2 sons and grandfather of 5, Furness-Smith today continues to enjoy an enthusiasm for life, with close contests on the golf course and at the bridge table. He remains observant about parliamentary politics and steadfastly believes that independent senators are the backbone of legislative democracy.